Kia ora.
Kia ora, my name's Gareth.
And I'm Roger.
And together,
we're Roger and Gareth.
Gareth and Roger. Welcome along to this Rainbow Walk Tour, and today we're doing the Violet Walk Tour, which starts at Parliament and goes on to the waterfront, and so should last around about an hour. And before we start, we should say a huge thank you to Hugh Young and Alison Laurie, and a lot of this tour is based on material that they've researched over the years and have kindly allowed us to incorporate into this walk tour.
Yes, so thanks to them.
Up to you.
Over to me. We are at Parliament, Wellington's Parliament, on the steps of Parliament. As you can see from this map here, yes, famous a month or so back for occupation and the freedom movement, being there for some weeks.
And we should say that the background here with this lovely green grass was actually taken in early January, so it was before the occupation. And so this is like the original grass before they had to replant it.
So it's all new grass now. Okay, so we're going to show a very special photo. Yeah, you can see in the middle there. It's showing 4 flags: the New Zealand flag, this is from left to right, the bisexual flag, the intersex flag, and the rainbow flag, and the transgender flag. That's 5 flags. All flying, you'll notice, at half-mast, and that is because this photo was taken in March 2019, just days after the mosque terror attacks in Christchurch. And at the start of the ILGA World Conference, which was being held in Wellington at that time. So it was only the second time that these flags have been flown at Parliament, and we'll talk a bit more about flags at Parliament a bit later in the tour. But let's start here by the flagpoles. 55 years ago, in fact, and half a world away from where we are now, in July 1967, the UK Parliament passed the Sexual Offences Act, which decriminalised homosexual acts between men aged over 21 in England and Wales, and that was after the findings of the Wolfenden report from the 1950s, which recommended that homosexual behaviour should no longer be considered a criminal offence. In New Zealand, things were starting to change very slowly too at this time, and in 1967, in July, the first meeting of the New Zealand Homosexual Law Reform Society was held in Wellington. It wasn't, however, until 1974 that the first parliamentary attempts at law reform took place, and that was with National MP Ven Young and his introduction of a Crimes Amendment Bill, which would have seen an age of consent of 21. Now keep in mind that for heterosexual sex the age of consent is 16. Labour Prime Minister Norman Kirk at the time opposed the bill, and he said that he wouldn't support any legislation that treated homosexuality as normal. At the same time, gay and lesbian liberation groups were forming throughout the country and becoming more vocal. In fact, this year is the 50th anniversary of the gay rights movement in New Zealand. In July 1975, Labour MP Gerald Wall moved an amendment that proposed imprisonment for anyone who communicated with someone under the age of 20 about homosexuality. So that means that groups and organisations that we know today, like Rainbow Youth or Inside Out or high school peer support groups, would have been made illegal.
That didn't go down so well.
Not surprisingly. As you can see from this photo here, there's Gerald Wall on the steps of Parliament, and a bit of an angry crowd in opposition to him there in front of him. Ven Young's bill was ultimately defeated by 5 votes, just 5 votes, 34 to 29, but there were 23 abstentions, which points out how much parliamentarians at the time, so we're talking the 70s, really didn't want to engage with the issue.
So even though the MPs didn't want to engage, well, the issues weren't going away, nor were the activists. And so in 1975, we saw our very first openly gay candidate for Parliament, and that was Robin Duff. But it would be a couple of years before actually we had an openly gay Member of Parliament. Who was the first male gay openly member?
I would say Chris Carter.
Chris Carter, absolutely, yes. So Chris came into Parliament, I think it was about 93, 94-ish, and was the first openly gay member of Parliament. In fact, he's actually just celebrated his 70th birthday, so happy birthday, Chris, if you're looking at this. What about the first openly out lesbian in Parliament?
Well, I want to say Marilyn Waring, but that might not be quite right.
Marilyn was in the National Party in the 1970s, and she was actually outed by the Truth newspaper. And so to her close friends, close circle, she was absolutely out, but to the kind of wider community, she wasn't. And so the Truth newspaper actually ran about a 6-week campaign to out her. And that actually resulted in a huge amount of support for Marilyn, because people thought, well, actually, it's none of our business. You know, why do we need to know this? Because the Truth weren't doing it as a positive thing. They were saying, look at this person, isn't this terrible? The first openly lesbian in Parliament was actually Marion Street. And when I say openly out, so before being elected, was openly out as well. And that was actually in 2005. So actually that's not that
very recent.
It's not that long ago. What about the first openly out transgender member of Parliament?
That has to be Georgina Beyer.
Georgina Beyer, absolutely. So this is a photo of Georgina when Georgina was mayor of Carterton district, just a bit northeast of Wellington. And so Georgina was in local body politics in the 1990s, then moved into national politics about in 1999, becoming the first openly anywhere in the world out transgender member of Parliament, which was very fantastic. Well, Georgina, in an interview a few years ago, remarked that one of her most proudest moments was when she and fellow gay MPs Tim Barnett and Chris Carter welcomed Carmen Rupe back to Parliament to celebrate Carmen's 70th birthday in 2006. And when Carmen came back to Parliament, she met both the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition. So the only other time that Carmen was at Parliament was in the 70s, and around the mid-70s, maybe just a little bit later, about 77, she did a television interview, and in that she claimed that she knew of one gay member of Parliament and a number of bisexual members of Parliament, and that was just so shocking to members of Parliament. They could not believe the disrespect she was affording the whole kind of parliamentary house. So they actually voted to bring her in front of the Privileges Committee, which is a committee in Parliament, and she ultimately apologised for actually daring to say that there might have been a gay or a bisexual member of Parliament. It was shocking. I mean, yeah, how times have changed.
Quite. Well, jumping forward to the mid-1980s and March 1985, and Labour MP Fran Wild introduces the Homosexual Law Reform Bill, and here's an image of her in Parliament in the lobby there talking to her supporters. Now, her bill set out to decriminalise homosexual activity between adult consenting males and make it illegal to discriminate against anyone based on their sexual orientation. So it took 16 months of heated debate, both in Parliament and out in the community, but eventually Part 1 of the bill, that which decriminalised homosexual acts between consenting adults, passed on the 9th of July 1986. However, Part 2 of the bill, that which dealt with discrimination, was lost, and so you could still perfectly legally discriminate against homosexuals in a number of areas. And I wonder if you know which areas those were.
Well, given we've been doing this tour for about 5 years, if I don't know, it will be
You're all in trouble.
an issue. So it was in accommodation, it was in services, so somebody could refuse to serve you in a shop, and it was in employment, so somebody could say, sorry, you're gay, I don't want to employ you. And that was actually advocated by John Banks, who was a member of Parliament, and he said he wanted to be able to discriminate in those very ways.
Yeah, and people did, up until 1993 with the introduction of the Human Rights Act. which outlawed discrimination also on the grounds of disability and HIV/AIDS. Now, the amendment to the Human Rights Act was championed by the Associate Minister of Health at the time, Catherine O'Regan, who sadly passed away in 2018. But in 2012, she apologised for not specifically including in that legislation transgender people.
Well, another anti-homosexual law reform person was the Member of Parliament for Invercargill, and that was Norman Jones. And this is a photo from photographer David Hinley. And actually also that Fran Wild photograph was also a David Hinley image as well. But this is Norman Jones, and he was rabidly against homosexual law reform. And at the time he was really grasping hold of HIV/AIDS, which were just coming into public awareness in New Zealand. And so he was saying things like he hoped that people with AIDS would die sooner rather than later to help prevent homosexual law reform, or the idea that decriminalising homosexual activity would legalise the spread of AIDS around New Zealand. So quite what we could say is just vile attitudes, vile human being. And I think that's all we need to say on Norman Jones.
All you need to say on him, but the flip side of that was that the argument using HIV and AIDS was used by the pro-reformers, because it meant that people who had HIV or AIDS or thought they might would feel they could seek help, medical help, because they would no longer be classed as criminals.
Absolutely. So at our next stop, we're going to be looking at some of those early HIV activists. And our next stop is, in fact, I'm just going to bring up the map.
Just a few steps away.
Well, so we're going from Parliament over Bowen Street to Turnbull House. And Turnbull House is a wonderful building. We can see it in the background here. And we'll talk a wee bit about Turnbull House just a bit later on. But one of the things that happened in Turnbull House back in the 80s was one of New Zealand's first workshops looking at safer sex messaging and AIDS. And that was run by Bruce Burnett. And here's a photo of Bruce. So Bruce was from Auckland originally, but had been living overseas in the 1970s, and in fact was living in San Francisco in 1981-82. And there he was very aware of the emergence of this new, what they called a gay cancer, which being AIDS. And it was only in 1981, on the 5th of June actually 1981, the first reports from the CDC, the Centre for Disease... What's the...
Control.
Centre for Disease Control in the US, put out its first report detailing 5 previously young, healthy gay men in Los Angeles who'd developed PCP, which is a form of pneumonia, which is now closely linked with HIV and AIDS. So it was very very current at the time that Bruce was in San Fran. Bruce also was very aware of the Shanti Project, which was in San Francisco. It was a community organisation that offered both, financial support, physical support, and emotional support for people with chronic illnesses. So at the time in New Zealand, there was no government agency that was actually putting out safer sex messages or prevention messages into the community. In 1983, Bruce was feeling unwell himself, and so he came back to New Zealand. And he started advocating for more resources to go into safer sex messaging. In 83-84, he, and along with a group of other people around the country, established the AIDS Support Network, which was very much based on the Shanti Project in the US. Very much a community-driven, from the grassroots, driven organisation. And that organisation actually allowed Bruce to go around the country as a one-man road trip, doing an AIDS roadshow, where he was able to basically talk about safer sex messaging and what to look for with the emergence of AIDS. When he was in Palmerston North, he actually courageously came out as somebody with AIDS, to the group and then to the wider society. There's quite a lot of footage of him on TV talking about the AIDS support network and AIDS. And it was courageous because at the time there was a lot of discrimination and stigma. So, for instance, things like people would say, we can't share cooking utensils, or we can't use the same bathroom, or we can't use the same swimming pool. So all of these really completely wrong assumptions around how AIDS was transmitted was happening. And so it was very courageous for Bruce to come out. Unfortunately, Bruce died not long afterwards. He actually died on the 1st of June 1985 from AIDS-related illnesses. But shortly after that, the AIDS support network morphed and turned into the New Zealand AIDS Foundation. And one of the key aspects of the AIDS Foundation is about kind of prevention, doing safer sex messaging, and that's a direct through line from the AIDS support network.
Well, as well as being a venue for HIV and AIDS workshops, Turnbull House was also the venue for a book launch from the author and journalist and tarot card reader Tom McLean. Now, Tom was a Scottish journalist who had lived in New Zealand since 1973, and he lived here until his death in 1989. He wrote a book about his experiences living with HIV and AIDS, and he called it If I Should Die. Now, he was carried into Turnbull House on a stretcher to launch that book on the 21st of March 1989, and he died 3 days later. Now, here's Tom's quilt on the part of the AIDS quilt, his panel, part of the AIDS quilt, and here's an excerpt from the book, If I Should Die. Remember my story about the garden. It's spring. You hold a tiny kitten in your hand, and you tell me how each form of life, no matter how small, is part of life itself. When we understand space and time, we'll know that in infinity, all we have is here and now. And sometimes in the here and now, you'll turn a corner to find a little garden. We'll sit down together under a spring sun and watch the kitten and the caterpillar, and I'll tell you again about the butterflies. And you maybe not be able to read it, but just along the top of Tom's quilt there is a wonderful saying, what the caterpillar calls the end of the world, the butterfly calls the miracle of life.
And just recently, actually last week, we were in contact with Tom's niece in Scotland. So if you're looking, it's lovely to have you on the tour. And Tom's niece was asking about Tom and about any footage or images we had of him. So it was lovely to hear from her.
Lovely to connect.
Yeah. Well, just getting back to Turnbull House, and Turnbull House was built for Alexander Turnbull, who has the image here. And Alexander Turnbull was born in 1868 in Wellington, but moved with his family back to London in shortly afterwards in 1875. But he actually returned in his early 20s. Now, Alexander was a real collector. He was a merchant where he got a lot of his money from, but he was a collector of maps, or a collector of books, manuscripts, photographs, and also kind of 3D objects as well. He amassed around about 55,000 items in his lifetime, and in 1915 he had this wonderful house built on Bowen Street, which at the moment is unoccupied. It was originally where his library was, but because it's an earthquake-prone building, it's now no longer occupied. But in 1918, unfortunately, Alexander died after an operation on his sinuses. But before he did, he had bequeathed his entire collection to New Zealand. And this is where we get our first national library. So
extraordinary, really generous.
Very generous. The Alexander Turnbull Library is based on his 55,000 items, which is really amazing. We actually have an image of, this is Alexander Turnbull's grave. So this is just up in Bolton Street Cemetery, just up the road. The graves were moved because they had the motorway construction, was it 1960s, I think. But this is where quite a number of the Turnbulls are actually buried. Now, in early gay circles, Alexandra was known as, quote, a screaming queen. However, we haven't seen any other kind of proof of that. I'm not quite sure what proof you'd need.
Not what we're looking for, but yeah. Careful research by biographers have failed to find anything.
That's what I was going to say.
But he never married. Say no more. We'll just spin on our heels a little bit and walk down to the cenotaph, which is just there on the intersection of Lambton Quay and Bowen Street. For a number of years at the cenotaph, 2 gay teachers laid wreaths on Anzac Day in memory of fallen gay and lesbian service people. Now, because the wreath included a pink triangle, the RSA deemed it too political, and so they were stopped from doing that. If we just take a bit of a closer look at the cenotaph, and if we remember the title of Tom McLean's book, If I Should Die, that is a quotation from a Rupert Brooke poem, The Soldier, If I Should Die. And Rupert Brooke has more words on the cenotaph. His words written there: these laid the world away, poured out the sweet wine of youth. The Irish poet W.B. Yeats described Brooke as the handsomest young man in England, and he might have been right if you look at the photo we have of Rupert Brooke. And he has a connection with Wellington in that he visited here in January 1914 on his way to Tahiti. This is before the First World War. And later that year he was commissioned in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, and then early the following year on his way to Gallipoli he developed sepsis from an infected mosquito bite and died on a French hospital ship just days before the Gallipoli landings.
We're going to move to our next stop now, which is just slightly up the road, so I'll just bring up the map. So we're actually going to Broadcasting House, which is looking like a bit of a park now, that kind of green area. But in fact, if we go back to the 1960s, early 1960s, this is what Broadcasting House would have looked like. And the right-hand side where the person walking in black is, that is called Museum Street. And that is actually where the first museum in New Zealand was, Colonial Museum, and so that was kind of located there. But in 1961, Broadcasting House was built here on the site. And I'll just change our background so you can kind of see
This is how it looks
today.
just fade out there.
A park with sculptures. In fact, when they demolished Broadcasting House in the 1990s, they couldn't actually demolish the foundations because it was so well built, and so actually they just had to pour kind of soil on top and hope for the best.
It was a civil defence headquarters.
It was a civil defence, and it had a tunnel through into Parliament, but it was meant not to be destroyed or not to be destroyable.
It was, however.
It was. But the reason why we're talking about Broadcasting House is because it was the home to many broadcasters. So the state broadcasters, so National Radio and Concert FM. It wasn't Concert at the time, Concert FM at the time. I think it was 2YC, was it? 2YC.
That was the concert program.
Program. But also the commercial stations like 2ZM, 1ZB, that kind of thing. Well, it would actually be 2ZB. 1ZB was in Auckland. But in the late 70s, there were a number of people in radio who thought that the state stations weren't allowing a variety of languages and voices and opinions on air. And so they came up with a plan of having a community radio station. And in fact, the first broadcast of a regular community station was Wellington Access Radio on the 5th of April 1981. The big thing with community access stations is that you don't have an external editor, so communities come in, they make programs about themselves for themselves and by themselves, that by, for and about. And that is kind of revolutionary because you don't actually have an external person saying, actually, you can't say that, or these are the things you need to talk about. It's what the community themselves want to hear. On that first broadcast, we had a feminist program called Leave Your Dishes in the Sink. And even though it wasn't explicitly rainbow, there were a number of lesbians on the feminist collective. In 1984, we had the lesbian community program begin, and this is really a remarkable story because it began in 1984 and has kept on going ever since.
Still going, yeah.
And so every weekend there's a broadcast from the community radio show, probably the longest, if not the longest, community radio program in New Zealand. A few years ago, the lesbian community radio program changed its name to an acronym called Quilted Bananas, and the acronym stands for Queer, Intersectional, Intersex, Lesbian, Takatapui, Trans, NB Non-Binary, Diverse, Bisexual, Asexual, and Nanas. Quote, because a lot of us also identify as nanas. And this was a real, this really highlights the change in language over the last 30, 40 years. Back in the 80s, there might have been one or two words that were describing communities and identities. And now there is such a rich mixture of identities, rich language to describe who we are and kind of what we do. The new title is, quote, celebrating all the slippery overlaps these communities can have and how finding your identity within them can be as messy but also fun as well, which is great. Another broadcaster in Access Radio was Gay BC, and Gay BC, there's a lovely photo here. This is actually from the 1990s, but Gay BC started around homosexual law reform in the mid-80s and was a real way of communicating information out to communities. Remember, this was a time when there wasn't the internet, there wasn't social media or smartphones, and so the radio was a key way of getting information out there. The Gay BC ran until the mid-2000s. But again, that was run by a collective as well. We're going to head now to our next stop, and our next stop is actually St Andrews on the Terrace. And the reason we are at St Andrews on the Terrace, it's a number of reasons. One is this performance from the Glamophones, and the Glamophones were performing here on the 18th of June 2016, and it was Gareth Farr's choral work during these days. And it was the first time that Gareth had actually composed something that was really politically gay, and it was there to commemorate and celebrate the 30th anniversary of homosexual law reform. The texts came from poets Philip Paxton and Brent Coots, and the work was also sung at Parliament to mark that occasion.
Well, a little bit more about St Andrews on the Terrace. It's the oldest Presbyterian congregation in New Zealand, and their history goes back to the arrival of the first ships of European settlers in Wellington in 1840. So the first service was held on Petone Beach with a congregation of around 147 settlers. And over the years, the church has changed locations a number of times. It's been on the Thorndon waterfront, on Lambton Quay near the Plymouth Steps, and here on the terrace in this brick incarnation, which was built about 1922. In 1975, the very Reverend John Murray became the minister, and he oversaw the church as a centre for social justice. Now, the congregation protested the 1981 Springbok tour and apartheid, and they stood in support of homosexual law reform, and more recently they've supported the Aotearoa Living Wage movement, refugee and migrant services, and marriage equality. On the 8th of December 1991, after homophobic resolutions were passed in the Presbyterian Church's General Assembly, St Andrews declared itself to be an inclusive church, and so there are numerous same-sex commitment ceremonies held here during the 1990s. And there have been regular LGBTI rainbow church services here since 1992, so for the last 30 years. Pretty amazing, really.
Well, a really strong advocate for equality and rainbow issues, among other things, was Reverend Dr. Margaret Mayman, who joined St Andrews in 2001. And the Reverend was a very strong advocate for marriage equality. And in fact, when marriage equality, the Lewissa Wall Bill, went into Parliament in 2012, can't believe that was 10 years ago, the Reverend and her partner were at the rally in front of Parliament, and Margaret had lost her voice, and so her partner spoke the words that Margaret was going to say. But the words that Margaret, some of those words were, "The biblical call to compassion, to love your neighbour as yourself, provides the faith mandate for marriage equality. Today we affirm the dignity and worth of all people and recognise sexual difference and diversity as a blessed part of our created being."
Awesome. And so St Andrews continues to be leading the forefront of social change in New Zealand, but other churches, unfortunately, have not been so quick to answer the call for change. Some have been staunchly opposed to same-sex marriage and homosexual law reform. For instance, the Salvation Army in the 1980s, they rallied against law reform, and the Army was integral in collecting signatures for the Keith Hay and Peter Tate anti-law reform petition. Now, the petition was presented on the steps of Parliament in September 1985, and it was quickly dubbed the Nuremberg Rally for its resemblance to the infamous torch-lit, flag-carrying 1936 rally of the Nazi Party in Nuremberg. And for good reason, because the presentation featured a platoon of young people, women in blue uniforms and men in white shirts, carrying New Zealand flags and wearing sashes emblazoned with the motto, "For God, for country, for family." The procession carried 91 boxes allegedly full of petition forms, one for each parliamentary electorate, up the steps to stack in front of Parliament's doors. As you can see here in this image, the boxes were handed to MPs Norman Jones, Graham Lee, John Banks and Jeff Braybrook.
It was interesting that the organisers really wanted 1 million petitions and they wanted 1 million signatures, which would have actually equalled a third of New Zealand's population at the time. And they claimed that they had 800,000, but some very clever pro-reform protesters at this rally kind of did the maths and worked out that actually these boxes are pretty much empty, given the amount of signatures that have been signed. And so they started chanting, "The boxes are empty, the boxes are empty." And it later turned out that a lot of the signatures were forgeries. Some people had signed as Mickey Mouse, signed multiple times. But actually, even though there were a lot of kind of question marks about the actual number of valid signatures, it was still a very large petition and certainly caught the public's imagination.
Well, it did catch the public's imagination, and we heard quite recently, didn't we, that in fact opinion polls at the time were not in favour generally of homosexual law reform in the 1980s. So Fran Wilder and her team were really fighting against the odds, pretty much.
And that bit of information came from Trevor Mallard, who was talking on the, what anniversary was it? Was it the 35th anniversary of homosexual law reform? And he was saying that it was not a popular bit of legislation at all. And I think actually only passed by about 3 or 4 votes. It was a very tight margin. I think it was 49 votes for and 44 against. But it passed.
Moving right along now to our next stop.
And our next stop is down at the Public Trust Office.
So this is just off Lambton Quay, corner of Lambton Quay and is that Balance Street? This building here. Here we go.
Lovely building.
Yeah. Now, the writer Frank Sargison was born Norris Davey in Hamilton in 1903, and in the late 1920s he got a job here at the Public Trust in this very building. Now, the building dates from 1908, and it's believed to be New Zealand's earliest steel-framed office building. By day, Norris worked there, but by night he enjoyed cruising the toilets and the beats of Wellington. Now, cruising means looking for anonymous sex. One night in 1929, he met Leonard Hollobin, who was known to the police and being monitored. The two went back to Leonard's boarding house, where the police were lying in wait in the next room. Bursting in, they found the two in flagrante delicto, masturbating each other, if you must know, or in legal terms, committing an indecent assault on each other. Norris was persuaded by the Crown to give evidence against Leonard and allow himself to be presented as the innocent party. In return, he received a suspended sentence, while Leonard got 5 years hard labour in New Plymouth prison. Now, after the court case, Norris went up north to stay with his much-loved uncle. But a couple of years later, he was forced off his uncle's farm by the Depression, and he emerged butterfly-like as Frank Sargeson, the writer. Now, in 2017, during the first reading of the bill to expunge historic gay convictions, like the one that Frank Sargeson had, Justice Minister at the time, Amy Adams, made an apology on behalf of the government to all those who were affected by historic gay convictions. Now, the bill was passed unopposed and became law in 2018, and the first two expungements happened later that year.
Well, in this building now, we have the Ministry for Culture and Heritage, and some of their meeting rooms are labelled with the names of some really iconic New Zealanders, including Frida Stark. And here's a photo of Frida. I'm not sure who the male dancer is, but Frida was a dancer. She was born in 1910 in Northland and then soon moved down to Auckland with her family. And by the age of 9, she was doing dance, things like tap, high kicks, tumbles, and hula. In the 1930s, she learnt classical ballet. And then by the time of World War II in the 1940s, she was doing exotic dancing at the Civic Theatre. And she was well known by the US troops. She was known as the Fever of the Fleet. And she would be almost completely naked. She would be in a G-string and completely painted in gold head to toe, which made her very famous. At the same time, she met fellow dancer Thelma Trott, and Thelma was also a dancer and was married to Eric Mario, who was a musician. And Eric didn't take too kindly to Thelma having a relationship with Frida, and so he actually poisoned Thelma with some sleeping tablets, an overdose of sleeping tablets, and unfortunately Thelma died. So Eric was subsequently charged with murder and a trial took place. During that trial, Frida was a key prosecution witness, and so all her personal life became very public. There were nude photographs, there was talk about lesbianism, all very public, and just very hard for Frida, considering she'd also lost, had a very close person killed as well. There were actually 3 trials, and in each of those trials Eric was convicted of murder, and he was ultimately sentenced to death, but that was then commuted to life imprisonment, and I think he only served about 12 years. After the trials, we had Frida move to the United Kingdom, and she stayed there for a couple of decades before returning to New Zealand in the late 1970s. When she died, her friends actually did a really wonderful thing. They buried Frida at the grave of Thelma, and so this is Thelma and Frida's grave in Auckland, and we've got Thelma at the top and Frida, waiting till we meet again, Frida.
Well, let's move along to our next stop, which is quite close to here.
That's right, and as we talk, I will just move our map.
So we're going to a brickwork building on Waring Taylor Street, just behind Midland Park, and it used to be Wellington's Central Police Station.
And here it is. So this is famous. In 1981, there were demonstrations outside this police station because it followed raids throughout the country on gay sex-on-site venues, so male saunas. Um, I, I don't know what the reasoning behind that was because these were private establishments. No one was hurting anyone, but the police felt that they needed to, I suppose, put their oar in. I mean, it's just persecution, really. So they would raid the saunas and then arrest the men. And of course, this is all pre-homosexual law reform, so they would be charged and potentially have a criminal record for having consensual activity. So there were protests both in Auckland, they had public demonstrations, and also outside this police station here in Wellington.
So if we just back up a little bit to the park itself, and the sculpture here, Woman of Words by the Auckland sculptor Virginia King, and this is of course Catherine Mansfield. And it commemorates her life and work. She was one of Wellington's and one of New Zealand's most famous writers. During the day, the sculpture reflects the movement of the surrounding area, and at night it becomes illuminated from within like a lantern. Now, Mansfield was born in 1888, and at 19 she left New Zealand and settled in the United Kingdom, and she became friends with modernist writers such as D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf. In 1917, she was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and that led to her death at the very early age of 34 in 1923. So Mansfield has well-documented relationships with both men and women, and her first same-sex romantic relationship that we know of was with Marta Mahupuku, who you can see in this photo here, a wealthy young Māori woman whom she'd met at school in Wellington. Mansfield writes, "I want Marta. I want her as I have had her, terribly. This is unclean, I know, but true." And then the second relationship that we know about is with Edith Kathleen Bendel, and Mansfield writes letters to her nightly in violet ink and invites her to stay alone with her over at the family batch across the harbour in Days Bay. Mansfield writes in her journal, Last night I spent in her arms, and tonight I hate her, which, being interpreted, means that I adore her, that I cannot lie in my bed and not feel the magic of her body. I feel more powerfully all those so-termed sexual impulses with her than I have with any man. So there you go. We should maybe leave Catherine Mansfield and that reverie with just one more quote from right at the end of Mansfield's life. Risk anything, care no more for the opinions of others, for those voices. Do the hardest thing on earth for you. Act for yourself. Face the truth.
That's a great quote.
Great quote.
Yeah. I have a feeling, I should check this up, but I think that was written in 1922, so that would be 100 years this year, 100th anniversary.
Wow.
It was either this year or next year in 2023, so but that's something to kind of have a think about. Now, to tie in Catherine Mansfield and Frank Sargeson, we have this image here, and this is actually Frank Sargeson and author-director Ngaio Marsh on the left-hand side, and they're actually walking in the Catherine Mansfield Memorial Garden in 1965 here in Wellington. And the occasion was that Frank had just been awarded the Catherine Mansfield Literary Award, so that's quite a nice tie-in, and also to bring in Ngaio Marsh, again, another very famous New Zealander. Yeah. Well, one of the other areas around this whole Midland Park is actually the Midland Hotel, which actually used to stand on where Midland Park is now. So let me just bring up a map. So Midland Hotel, there's a bit of greenery there. That's actually Midland Park now, but actually the hotel itself used to look like this. Kirkcaldy and Staines is on the far right-hand side, and so you've got Lambton Quay running left to right, and so the Midland Park was just in that right corner, and you can actually see the Wellington Central Police Station on the far right-hand side, just off Midland Park Hotel.
It's running behind it there.
So so the police station actually ran across the entire block. It was quite a large building. But what we're talking about with Midland Hotel is that the very famous author Somerset Maugham, the British writer, stayed here in 1917, and he stayed here with his partner Gerald Haxton. So they had met during World War One, and I'll just bring up Somerset here. So Somerset was too old to go to war during World War One, but became part of the Red Cross. And it was at that point he met Gerald, who had come over from San Francisco, and they had a 30-year relationship. At the same time, Somerset was actually married to Siri Welcome, and that marriage lasted for about 13 years. When Gerald and Somerset were in Wellington, Somerset was already very famous. He had about 10 plays published, I think it was around about 10 plays published and performed as well. So he was very, very well known. And
not to mention his novels.
And his novels, yeah. And they were on their way to Tahiti, and Wellington and New Zealand was a bit of a stopping point on the way up north. In I won't say 1917. Later, after the marriage to Surrey, Somerset Maugham actually talked to his nephew Robin about his bisexuality. He said, quote, "I tried to persuade myself that I was 3/4 normal, that only a quarter of me was queer, whereas really it was the other way around."
Well, while we're here at Midland Park, we can't move on without talking about Shelley Tuariki Howard. And the park was built after the hotel was demolished in 1980, but it was here in 2015 that Shelley, who's a feminist, trans activist and community icon, conducted a social experiment and education campaign highlighting the differences between tolerance and acceptance. This great image of Shelley was taken by Kate Spencer. Now, Shelley stood blindfolded here in the park with arms outstretched, with two signs beside her. One summarised data from the Youth 2012 survey, which showed that despite the many hardships faced by transgender youth, they were still the most active in youth communities and helping and assisting others. And the second sign read, "I am transgender. I honour you. Will you honour me? Awhi mai, hug me." Well, in an interview with Jack Lynch, Shelley recalled how she engaged with around 25 people that day, and how with some people she could feel the distance between them even though they were hugging. But with others, the hearts really engaged and she could feel the sincerity. So Shelley reflected on those interactions, and when she spoke to Jack, she said, "Now that you've got this information, what are you going to tell your children? What are you going to tell your partner? Are you going to go to the local school board of trustees and tell them that we have to do more for queer identifying youth?" Well, sadly, Shelley passed away in November 2017.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to go on to the waterfront now, and before we do, well, actually, one of the things on the waterfront that we'll just point out is this wonderful Catherine Mansfield poem. This is just around by Te Papa, and it looks out onto the waterfront. There are quite a number of these kind of little poems dotted around the waterfront. This is a really nice one as well. There's also one for Bruce Mason around by Circa Theatre. But we're actually going to kind of just zoom out a wee bit further and go into Wellington Harbour.
And just over 100 years ago, on the 16th of October 1914, almost 8,500 men and 4,000 horses set sail from the wharves around here for the First World War. Now, 10 troop ships were in the harbour, and they left on that day, and on board were 2 soldiers, Norman Gibson and Roy Ayling. They met, we think, in Trentham military camp, or possibly a little bit later in Egypt on the way to Europe. They became lovers. Roy was 28 and Norman was 19. The artist Toss Wollaston notes in his autobiography Sage Tea that Roy had told me he had seen the younger while at the war, poised for a dive when they were swimming, and loved his beautiful body. Well, they were together during the Battle of the Somme, and Norman was wounded and evacuated, and Roy wrote this poem to him. It was published in 1917 in the book New Zealand at the Front. Form like Hercules of old, mighty limbs in shapely mould, manly strength in beauty rolled, old sunshine. Now that we are far apart, longing makes the hot tears start. Who can ease my aching heart? Old sunshine. Well, after the war, Roy and Norman bought a farm together, and they lived there for some years. Roy left Norman in 1931, and they both subsequently married women. And in 1997, Norman's daughter Miriam Safira wrote a biography of her father titled A Man's Man, A Daughter's Story.
I've got to say that the day we went and photographed Wellington Harbour, it was just the most amazing day, the most amazing blues.
It's always like that.
Always like that. Today is just, well, it's a spitting image really, isn't it? We're actually going now to a stop that's actually in the middle of the harbour, and this is Matu Soames Island. And Matu Soames Island has been used for a whole variety of things, including it was a quarantine facility not only for animals in the, I think, the 50s and 60s, but going back it was also for the influenza outbreak in 1918. They would port passengers from incoming ships onto the island, or people that were infected, they would go onto the island. But during World War I, it was also used to house enemy aliens, particularly German nationals, wasn't it?
And Italians.
And Italians. And on Matu Soames Island, we also had Dr. Helmer von Danneville. And Helmer had come to New Zealand around 1910, and one of the things with Helmer is that Helmer's backstory is not well known, and so immediately was raising suspicions the moment Helmer came to New Zealand. Helmer was working in a health home in Miramar, and apparently had an unnaturally strong influence on female patients. This image is actually from a Solicitor General's investigation into Helmer, and as you can see, the clothing, the hair was setting Helmer apart. I have to say that in Europe and in the US, this kind of what they call it, like mannish attire, that's kind of the words that were being used, was not uncommon for anyone to be wearing. But this in Wellington in 1910, 1912, 1914 did cause a bit of a stir. It actually brought Helmer to the notice of the Women's Anti-German League, and they were very suspicious of the doctor. And so, as I say, the police investigated Helmer. Helmer actually underwent 2 physical examinations, because actually the Solicitor General noted, this is a quote from their report, "There is a grave ground for suspicion that this person is a mischievous and dangerous impostor. There is much reason to suspect that she may be a man masquerading as a woman." As I say, Helmer had 2 physical examinations and actually was put onto Matu Soames Island as a prisoner. 6 weeks went by, and Helmer actually had a severe nervous breakdown, and so was taken off the island.
She was the only female prisoner on the island.
Yeah. After the war, Helmer and a female companion with children left New Zealand and went to Australia and then to San Francisco, and Helmer died in San Francisco in 1930. An extraordinary life, and the whole investigation file is actually available at Archives New Zealand, and might actually be available online. I'll need to check that, but potentially it could be through Archives New Zealand website. You might be able to see the entire investigation file.
It's an extraordinary story. Well, on to our last stop now, and we're heading toward Frank Kitts Park, also known as Whairepo.
The lagoon, really, isn't it?
The lagoon, really, yeah, that's right, it's known as Whairepo. It was the starting point for the 2016 Pride Parade, and it was also the venue for the Candlelight Memorial on June 2016 for the victims of the Orlando nightclub massacre. Beyond that, Frank Kitt's Lagoon, which was the venue for the Beacons of Hope candlelight memorials in the 1990s. Now, at the memorial ceremonies, the peak in 1993, there were services held throughout the country: Kaitaia, Tauranga, Rotorua, Nelson, Christchurch, Timaru, Hamilton, Napier, Palmerston North, Blenheim, Dunedin and Invercargill, so right throughout the country. In Auckland, there was a memorial service at St Matthew's in the city, which was followed by the lighting of flaming torches. And here in Wellington, the torches were held high in the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra and the National Youth Choir performed at an event here at the Lagoon. Quite amazing, really.
So the torches were dotted right around the outside of the lagoon, so it was like just flaming torches, wasn't it? Quite
Very
moving.
striking.
Yes, yeah. Well, one of the many treasures that Te Papa, the National Museum, hold, and Te Papa is just to the left of our background image, which we can't see, but the museum holds the New Zealand AIDS Memorial Quilt, and actually it was gifted 10 years ago, so it came into the museum 10 years ago. The first panel in that quilt is actually for Peter Cuthbert, and Peter Cuthbert's partner, Daniel Fielding, was one of the main drivers of getting the AIDS Memorial Quilt into New Zealand. Originally, the idea for the AIDS quilt came from Cleve Jones in San Francisco in the mid-80s, and it was very much about a living memorial to those that had passed through AIDS-related conditions. Each panel of the quilt is measuring 6 feet by 3 feet, which is the size of a standard grave. And it was very much a way of memorialising, but also educating, and a real tangible remembrance of someone. So in New Zealand, the first quilts were offered up in the end of 1988 on World AIDS Day. Both Peter and Daniel were diagnosed with AIDS in 1984, and Peter passed away in 1988. But Daniel actually lived until 2005, and I think a lot of that was probably due to the change in the drug treatments that were available. So around the mid-1990s, the combination drugs came into being and really gave people a lot more kind of lifespan. And of course nowadays you can live an absolutely completely normal age expectancy if you're on HIV medication, so that's quite different from what it was years ago. Panels of the quilt can be viewed at Te Papa by arrangement, so you can just ring them up and say, I'd like to see this particular panel. All of the panels are also online on their website.
And finally on our tour, another influence coming out of San Francisco was the rainbow flag, which has been picked up by many LGBTI rainbow communities around the world. As part of Wellington's Pride Parade in 2017, a 50-metre long rainbow flag was paraded for the first time in New Zealand down Courtenay Place onto the waterfront towards Waitangi Park. Now, this particular flag was created in the United Kingdom by a group of people whose partners had passed away from AIDS-related conditions. Now, the flag's been carried down the streets of London, Paris, Sydney and in Singapore. And the rainbow flag was created by the US-based activist Gilbert Baker as part of a collective in 1978, and he refused to trademark it, seeing that it was a symbol for the LGBTI rainbow communities to own, not for one individual to own.
And to tie us back to Parliament where we started, we have this image, and this is an image from Jack Lynch, and it is showing us the rainbow flag flying for the very first time at Parliament on the 6th of July 2016. So that's marking the 30th anniversary of homosexual law reform. And then just a couple of years later, we actually had 4 flags flying for the very first time in front of Parliament. So we've got the bisexual, intersex, rainbow and transgender flags. This is the first time anywhere in the world where those 4 flags are flying in front of a seat of parliament or a seat of governance, which was really stunning. We not only do we have flags like this outside of Parliament, we now have flags inside Parliament, and this is an image of the Rainbow Room. So that's a select committee room in Parliament. It was originally given birth to as the Rainbow Room in 2008, then it was refurbished in about 2019. Has a lot of flags, has a lovely artwork in the centre there from Dr. Elizabeth Kerikeri. And then on the right-hand side, there are portraits of out MPs, former out MPs, which is really stunning. And
that really concludes this tour. Thank you to Alison Laurie and to Hugh Young for their original research, which we've drawn upon. Thank you for watching this tour. And if you have any feedback, we'd love to hear it. You can either comment on this page, or you can go to our Facebook page, or send us an email. That'd be great.
Yep. And so hopefully next month, so in June, we're going to start doing physical walk tours again now that the kind of COVID situation has calmed down a wee bit. And so hopefully we will be able to see you physically in Wellington.
Face to face, that would be great.
But we'll try and keep on doing the virtual ones as well, because we realise that there is an audience outside of Wellington that maybe wants to connect with kind of rainbow heritage here in Wellington. Have a lovely afternoon, and we'll see you a bit later on.
Next time. Ka kite.
Bye-bye.